The people who hurt you the deepest rarely do it with their fists. They do it with their absence, with the way they look right through you when you're carrying something heavy, and they decide it isn't theirs to hold. I learned that late at 59, standing in my own hallway with my hands shaking, realizing loyalty isn't a vow you say once. It's a decision you make when it costs you. I'm Harold Bennett. I've worked the water most of my life, a fisherman out of Los Angeles. The kind of man who wakes up before the sun and trusts weather more than words, because weather at least tells you the truth. My wife left my 82-year-old mom, gasping in our living room. I simply said, "Okay." The next morning, her phone rang and everything changed. 7:42 a.m. Wednesday, January 14th. The kitchen smelled like plain oatmeal and the lemon dish soap Margaret liked, the one she insisted on buying even when it was $1 more, because she said it made the plates feel honest, and my mother was sitting at the small table by the back window, her cardigan buttoned wrong, quietly trying to fix it without asking for help. She didn't make speeches. Margaret Harper never did. She just showed love in tiny repairs, folding dish towels into perfect rectangles, rinsing her teacup the moment she was done, leaving 2 almonds on my saucer because she remembered I liked them. Outside, the palm fronds were barely moving, and the marine layer had crept in from the coast like a slow gray blanket. The kind of morning that makes Los Angeles feel older than it is. I'd packed my cooler already, ice to the top, 2 thermoses, 1 black coffee for me and 1 chamomile for her, even though she wasn't coming, because routine is how you tell someone they're still part of the world. Vanessa was still upstairs, and I could hear her dresser drawer open and close, neat, controlled, like she was filing her life into sections. Vanessa Harper, my wife, liked everything clean, surfaces clear, feelings cleared out too if she could manage it. Early on, I told myself it was just her way, that she'd grown up with nothing and now she needed order. And when Margaret moved in after her fall last spring, I explained away the tightness in Vanessa's smile, the way she'd wipe the counter again after my mother touched it, the way she'd say, "Your mom," instead of Margaret, as if a name was too intimate. At 8:11 a.m., I was tying my boots by the entry rug, the faded blue one Margaret had mended twice, when I heard a sound from the living room that didn't belong in any normal morning, a thin, wet inhale, like someone trying to pull air through a straw. I looked up, and my mother was half standing, one hand on the arm of the couch, the other pressed flat to her chest, her mouth open but her voice trapped somewhere deep. I crossed the room in 3 strides, my knees popping, my hand suddenly clumsy, and I said, "Mom," not loud, just enough to keep her with me, and her eyes found mine, apologetic even then, like she was sorry for taking up space. Vanessa came down the stairs at 8:12 a.m., fully dressed, hair perfect, phone already in her hand, and she stopped on the last step like she was looking at a spill she didn't want to step in. I said, "Call 911, now," and my voice stayed level the way it does on a boat when something goes wrong, because panic doesn't fix rope knots. She didn't move right away. She looked at my mother, then at me, and her thumb hovered over her screen like making the call would cost her something she couldn't get back. I said it again, "Vanessa, please," and I heard my own restraint, that old habit of keeping peace. She finally came closer, not to my mother, to me, and she tilted her head, calm as a cashier, and she said, "Figure it out yourself." She didn't even look up when she said it. And that's the detail that keeps returning to me. Not like a movie scene, but like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. My mouth went dry. I nodded once because there wasn't time to teach someone how to be human, and I said, "Okay." And the door to the downstairs bathroom closed gently behind her a moment later. Not slammed, just shut like she was protecting her morning from our emergency. At 8:13 a.m., I grabbed my phone with my left hand while my right arm held my mother upright, and I dialed 911, my thumb slipping once because my skin had gone slick with fear. The operator answered on the second ring, and I remember that because I'd been a fisherman long enough to count seconds the way other men count blessings. 2 rings meant help was still possible, and I said, "My mother can't breathe." She's 82. We're at 1849 West 83rd Street. Los Angeles, please." And my voice didn't crack. It went flatter, like my throat had turned into a piece of rope. Margaret's fingers were cold on my wrist. Not gripping, just resting there. Like she didn't want to inconvenience me even while her body was failing. She made a small sound, more of an apology than a moan, and I leaned close and told her, "Stay with me, Mom. Just keep looking at me." Because when you're out on the water in bad weather, you pick a fixed point and you don't let your eyes leave it. Vanessa's bathroom faucet turned on, a thin stream, steady, domestic, like she was washing her hands of the whole thing. I heard the mirror cabinet click shut. I heard the soft whir of her hairdryer start and then stop. Like she'd remembered she didn't have time for that. There was no hurry in her movements, and I didn't have the space to hate her for it, not yet. I just noted it the way you note a reef on a chart, a danger you'll remember later. The operator told me to lay Margaret down if I could, to check if her lips were turning blue, to unlock the front door, and I did it all in a sequence that felt practiced even though it wasn't, because routine is what men fall back on when the world starts moving too fast. I eased my mother down on the living room rug, the one with the stitched hibiscus flowers she liked, because it reminded her of her sister's old curtains, and as her back touched the floor, she reached for the hem of my jacket and smoothed it. Between her fingers, twice, a tiny, pointless act of care. That was Margaret. Even in crisis, she tried to tidy the people she loved. I crawled to the front door, my knees sliding on tile, and unlocked it. Then I went back and sat beside her, one hand under her shoulder, the other holding her hand. Her skin smelled like the lavender lotion she used sparingly, like it was gold. At 8:18 a.m., I heard a knock at the side gate, not the front, because Mrs. Linton always came through the side like she belonged here, which in a way she did. Mrs. Linton was 74, a widow with iron-gray hair and those steady eyes that make you feel like someone's watching the world, so you don't have to. I hadn't called her yet, which meant she must have heard something. Maybe my voice, maybe the way the morning had shifted. I opened the door and she was already stepping in, cardigan on, keys in hand. And she didn't ask 10 questions like people do when they're scared. She just looked at Margaret on the floor, then at me, and I said, "I need help," and she said yes in under 5 seconds. A plain yes that landed like a plank laid across a gap. "I'll take her," she said. Already moving to get a blanket. Already reaching for Margaret's purse because she knew hospitals ask for everything. "Ambulance is coming," I told her. And she nodded once, not arguing, not making it about herself. In the background, Vanessa came out of the bathroom at 8:19 a.m. Lipstick on now, not bright. Just enough to say she'd had time. And she stood near the archway with her arms folded and her phone in her hand. She watched Mrs. Linton tuck the blanket around my mother's shoulders, watched me keep my palm on Margaret's sternum like I could hold her heart in place, and for one flicker of a second, Vanessa's face softened, not with compassion exactly, but with something like calculation meeting discomfort. That was her human moment, the part of her that knew this looked bad. Then her expression smoothed again, and she turned slightly, as if to distance herself without leaving the room, and she said nothing, which somehow felt worse than words. The EMTs arrived at 8:24 a.m., 2 of them, one tall with a shaved head and one shorter woman with freckles, and they moved with that quiet competence I respect, like men and women who've seen too much and still show up anyway. They asked questions, checked oxygen, lifted my mother with practiced care, and Margaret apologized, actually apologized, as they strapped the monitor to her chest. "Sorry," she whispered, eyes on the ceiling. "You're doing great," the freckled EMT said. Soft as a daughter, and Margaret nodded once like she believed her. As they wheeled her out, Mrs. Linton took my elbow, guiding me the way you guide someone who's trying not to fall apart. And she said, "Bring your wallet and her papers." Harold? And I realized she'd already gone into Margaret's room and found the folder she kept in the top drawer, the one labeled in neat handwriting, medical, like she'd been preparing for the day her body would betray her. Vanessa didn't offer to drive. She didn't offer to come. She stood at the base of the stairs and scrolled, thumb moving, and when I looked at her, really looked at her, she raised her eyes just long enough to say, "I have a meeting." Calm, like that was a law of nature. I nodded again, because my mother's oxygen was dropping and my life had just narrowed to one thing. "Okay," I said, and I left. The ambulance took Margaret to St. Francis Medical Center in Linwood, and I followed in Mrs. Linton's silver Camry because my hands were shaking too much to trust myself behind the wheel for long. The streets were wet from the marine layer, and the traffic on the 105 was already tightening, headlights glowing dull in the morning haze. At 8:57 a.m., we were in the emergency department, fluorescent lights, the smell of sanitizer and burnt coffee, and I watched them wheel my mother through the double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She turned her head as far as the straps would allow, and her eyes met mine, and she did that small thing again. A tiny nod, like she was saying, "I'm still here, don't make a fuss." Mrs. Linton squeezed my forearm once, just pressure and then let go, and she went straight to the admissions desk without being asked, because some people don't need permission to do the right thing. Vanessa called at 9:14 a.m., 1 ring, 2 rings, then her voice. Light, controlled. "Is she fine?" she asked. Not hello, not how are you. "She's not fine," I said. "They're running tests." A pause then. "Well, I can't leave work. Keep me posted." "Okay," I said again and ended the call. At 10:26 a.m., a doctor with tired eyes and a navy scrub cap explained that Margaret was in atrial fibrillation, that her heart rhythm was irregular and fast, that she'd likely had a small clot risk, that they needed consent for certain medications and potentially a procedure if her rhythm didn't stabilize. The doctor's words were careful, not dramatic, the way doctors talk, when they don't want you to panic. But they also don't want you to miss the seriousness. "She has an advance directive," I said, because Mrs. Linton had put that folder in my lap as we drove. "And I think there's a power of attorney." The doctor nodded. "We'll need the medical power of attorney. Who is her agent?" I opened the folder. Margaret's handwriting was there on the tabs, thin and tidy. Advance directive, insurance, list of meds. Then a document in a clear sleeve, 2 signatures, 2 witnesses. And there it was, the line that would change everything later, even though in that moment it only felt like a lifeline. Medical power of attorney, agent, Daniel Harper. Daniel Harper was my older brother, a quiet man who lived out in Riverside and kept to himself since his divorce. But he was steady, and my mother trusted him. I'd known the document existed, vaguely, but I'd never needed it. Never looked at the name like it mattered. It mattered now. The doctor said, "We'll contact Mr. Harper for consent if needed. You can also call him. But legally, he's the decision maker." Mrs. Linton leaned in and whispered, "Call Daniel." And I did. Daniel answered on the first ring at 10:34 a.m., voice gravelly like I'd woken him. "Danny," I said, "it's Mom. She's at St. Francis. Her heart's out of rhythm. They need you to be ready to consent." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm coming." 3 words, no questions. No lecture about why I hadn't called sooner, no drama. That was the contrast that kept repeating in my mind. Vanessa's calm cruelty. "Figure it out yourself." And Daniel's calm loyalty. "I'm coming," like family still meant something to him. By noon, Margaret was stabilized enough to move to a monitored room, and I sat beside her bed, watching the green lines on the screen rise and fall, watching her hands. Those thin hands that used to peel apples for me when I was 10. Those hands now with an IV taped down. At 12:17 p.m. she opened her eyes, and she didn't ask where Vanessa was. She didn't ask why her daughter-in-law hadn't shown up. She just looked at me and reached for the edge of the blanket and tried to pull it, higher on her own, the same instinct to handle her own discomfort, to keep the world neat. I helped her, tucking it up around her shoulders, and she whispered, "You didn't eat." "I'm fine," I told her. She moved her lips like she was chewing a thought. Then she said, "Don't let anyone make you feel small." It wasn't a speech, it was barely a sentence, but it hit me like a hook set deep, because it told me she knew, she'd always known, what Vanessa had been doing to the air in our home. Daniel arrived at 1:06 p.m., jacket thrown on over work clothes, eyes red like he'd driven fast and hard, and he hugged me once, brief, man to man. Then he went right to Margaret's bedside and touched her hand like you touch something sacred. Vanessa didn't arrive that day. She didn't arrive the next morning either. She sent one text at 6:43 p.m. Any updates? And another at 7:02 a.m. I'm slammed today. When I came home the second night, at 9:28 p.m., the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels staged. Vanessa was at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine, laptop open, and she looked up like I'd returned from a grocery run, not from sitting beside my mother's heart monitor for 14 hours. "How is she?" she asked. "Still in the hospital," I said, hanging my jacket. She nodded and said, "So what are we doing about care? Because I can't do this." There it was, the problem she wanted solved, not the person. I poured myself water, not wine, and the glass clinked against the counter. A small sound and a big silence. "What do you mean you can't?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Vanessa's face tightened in that controlled way, and she said, "Harold, I'm not built for elderly care, and I'm not paying for her." I felt the words settle in my chest, not like anger, more like the final click of a lock. The moment you realize a door you thought was yours has been closed for a long time. I nodded once. "Okay," I said, and Vanessa exhaled like she'd won something, like my quiet meant agreement, and she went back to her laptop. That night at 11:46 p.m., I stood alone in the laundry room with the light off, staring at the red glow of the dryer numbers counting down, and I let myself feel it just once, not rage, not revenge, just grief. The kind that comes when you realize you married someone who can watch an old woman struggle for breath and still think about her meeting, her money, her plans. My hands shook, and I gripped the edge of the washing machine until the trembling slowed. Because on a boat, you don't get to fall apart. You just tie a tighter knot. At 8:03 a.m. the next morning, I went to the hospital with a clean set of clothes for Margaret and a bagel. I knew she'd only nibble. And she did nibble, 2 bites. Then she folded the napkin carefully, square over square, like folding something gave her control. Mrs. Linton sat with her while I stepped into the hallway to take a call from Daniel. He said, "The doctor wants to discuss rehab options and home care. Legally, I can sign. But I want you to tell me what you think is right." I stared at the scuffed hospital floor and I heard Vanessa's voice again. "Figure it out yourself." And I realized I had been doing that for years in small ways, excusing her, smoothing things over, pulling my own heart back into rhythm the way the doctors had done for Margaret. "I think Mom needs to be somewhere safe," I said. "And she needs someone who won't resent her for breathing." Daniel was quiet, then he said, "Then we do it." On Friday, 3:18 p.m., after Margaret's discharge plan was set for a short rehab stay, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, with my phone and a cup of coffee that had been cooked into bitterness. I looked up, elder law attorney near me, and I didn't tell myself I was being dramatic. I didn't try to rationalize Vanessa's words. I just accepted the shape of reality. I called attorney Marisol Vega at 3:26 p.m. Her receptionist answered, and by 3:31 p.m. Marisol was on the line, voice clear, not warm exactly, but steady. "Tell me what's happening," she said. So I did, calmly, in order like I was giving coordinates. I told her about the emergency. Vanessa refusing to call 911, the money talk, the stress, the way Vanessa framed my mother like a burden she hadn't agreed to. Marisol didn't gasp. She didn't feed the drama. She said, "Do you have documentation, texts, dates?" "Yes," I said. "And my brother's medical POA." There was a short pause, then she said, "Good. That gives us clean lanes. If your mother needs care and there's conflict in your household, we can structure decisions legally so your wife cannot interfere. And if you need to protect assets or set boundaries, we do it with paperwork, not arguments." That sentence, clean lanes, paperwork, not arguments, felt like someone handing me a compass. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived like nothing was happening. I got up at 4:20 a.m., made coffee, checked tide charts even though I wasn't going out much, and I packed Vanessa's lunch the way I always did when she forgot. Turkey on wheat, apple slices, a small bag of chips, because routine can be both kindness and camouflage. When she asked, "How's your mom?" I answered, "Stable," and went back to rinsing dishes. When she complained about hospital bills, I said, "We'll handle it," and I kept my voice mild. Meanwhile, at 9:00 a.m. on Tuesday, February 3rd, I met Marisol Vega in her office on Wilshire Boulevard, Suite 620, a place that smelled like paper and lemon cleaner, and she slid a yellow legal pad toward me and said, "We're going to do 3 things. 1. Protect your mother's discharge and care plan through the existing medical POA. 2. Make sure your wife cannot block access or decisions. 3. If necessary, restructure your beneficiary designations and your will so that the people who showed up are protected." I stared at the pad. "You can do that," I said, more statement than question. Marisol nodded. "Yes, quietly, legally. I signed 47 pages over 2 meetings. Hands steady, initials in the corners, dates written clearly. Not because I was eager, but because I was tired of living with a woman who treated compassion like a negotiable expense. The paperwork twist wasn't flashy, it was boring on purpose, the way real consequences are, but it had teeth. Daniel, as medical power of attorney, signed for Margaret's rehab placement without Vanessa's input, which meant Vanessa didn't get to veto anything just because it happened under our roof. And then, at Marisol's guidance, I updated my pension beneficiary and life insurance, not out of spite but out of alignment, so that if something happened to me, the money that came from my years on the water wouldn't land in the hands of someone who could say, "Figure it out yourself," to an old woman in distress. I created a small trust for Margaret's ongoing care, with Daniel as co-trustee, and I did it all without raising my voice once. Welcome to the Dad Chronicles. Get comfortable and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Vanessa stayed comfortable because I let her. She still went to her meetings, still bought her expensive candles, still posted pictures of brunch like life was a showroom. She even brought Margaret flowers once. A week later, pale roses in a glass vase, and she stood at the rehab facility doorway with a tight smile, and Margaret thanked her, because Margaret always thanked people, even when they didn't deserve the tenderness. Vanessa had her one more human moment there, watching my mother try to lift the vase with hands that trembled, and Vanessa's face softened again, guilt flickering, and she reached out to steady it, just for a second. Then she let go and said, "Well, get better soon," like recovery was a preference. That was when I knew the softness wasn't love. It was discomfort at being seen. On Monday, February 23rd, 2:40 p.m., Vanessa came home to find an official-looking envelope on the kitchen counter. I didn't place it there, Marisol did, by certified mail, because official processes have a way of landing without emotion. Vanessa called my phone at 2:42 p.m. even though I was sitting in the driveway, engine off, just breathing for a moment before going inside. "Harold," she said, voice sharp but controlled. "What is this? Why is some attorney sending me paperwork?" "It's information," I said. "Information about what?" "About who can make medical decisions for Margaret," I said, "and about our financial structure going forward." There was a beat of silence, then I heard paper rustle, her nails tapping the page. "She named Daniel," Vanessa said like it was an accusation. "Yes," I said. "So I don't get a say," she said, and now her voice had a small crack in it. Not sadness, just the sound of someone realizing they aren't in control. I answered with the truth. Plain. "You said figure it out myself." "That was one moment," she said quickly, trying to patch it. I didn't argue. I didn't list the texts, the absence, the wine glass while my mother lay under fluorescent lights. I said it was enough. At 2:51 p.m., her phone beeped, and I heard it through the line, that distinctive tone when a call comes in. Then Vanessa went quiet in a way I recognized. The way people go quiet when their world shifts under them. "What?" she said more to herself. Then I heard another voice, faint through the receiver, professional and calm. A second call she'd answered. A conference she hadn't chosen. "This is Marisol Vega's office," the voice said. "Mrs. Harper, we are calling to confirm receipt of the beneficiary change notifications, and to advise you that You are not authorized to access or alter the medical discharge. Planned for Margaret Harper, any interference will be documented. Vanessa's breath caught. Not a sob, just a stunned inhale. I'm his wife, Vanessa said, and for the first time there was something like fear under the polish. The voice stayed even. I understand. This is lawful. You were notified. Vanessa's tone turned pleading without fully becoming it. Harold, why are you doing this? I finally walked into the house at 2:56 p.m. Slow, keys in my hand, and Vanessa was standing in the kitchen with the envelope open. Papers spread, her wine untouched. Her face drained of its practiced color. She looked at me like I was a stranger who'd moved into her life. Are you divorcing me? She asked. I set my keys down gently. No slam, no flourish. I'm protecting my mother, I said. You changed your beneficiaries, she said, voice thinner now. Yes, I said. That's my future, she whispered. I looked at her, truly looked, and I kept my voice calm, short, like Marisol had taught me. What about Margaret's future? I asked. Vanessa swallowed, eyes flashing, searching for the right leverage, the right guilt button, and then she said, You're choosing her over me. I nodded once. I'm choosing decency. Her shoulders sagged, and the size of what she'd lost landed on her in a quiet way. Not cinematic, just heavy. She had built her life around being the priority, and now paperwork had made her optional in the one place she expected power. In our family. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. Vanessa tried one last angle, softer voice, almost tender, the version of her I'd fallen for years ago. I was scared, she said. I didn't know what to do. I didn't mean it like that. I didn't call her a liar. I didn't punish her with a speech. I just asked, Then why didn't you call 911? She opened her mouth, then closed it. No answer came out that could survive daylight. I picked up my jacket from the chair and said, I'm going to see Mom. And I left. Because leaving is sometimes the only way a man proves he means what he signed. Margaret came home 2 weeks later, not to my house, not to Vanessa's tension, but to a small, clean apartment Daniel arranged near his place in Riverside, one with wide doorways, and a little patio where she could sit in the sun. Mrs. Linton helped pack. Margaret's things from my house, and Vanessa stayed upstairs the whole time, not hiding exactly, just absent in the way she'd always been when it mattered. Margaret didn't shame her. She didn't ask for apologies. She just folded her sweaters one by one, and placed a small framed photo of my father in a box with care, as if dignity was a practice, not a mood. On the last trip to the car, Margaret paused at the doorway and looked back into the living room where she'd sat by the window, where she'd eaten oatmeal and fixed her buttons. Vanessa finally appeared then, standing at the top of the stairs, and for a moment the three of us were held in the same frame, like a family portrait that had cracked down the middle. Margaret looked up and said softly, Thank you for having me. Vanessa's eyes glistened, just barely, and she said, Of course, but her voice didn't match her words. Margaret nodded and turned away. That was the last time my mother stood in that house. The divorce came later, quietly, processed through Marisol's office. No shouting, no throwing things. Just signatures and disclosures and a timeline that felt like a long exhale. Vanessa kept what she'd brought in. I kept what I'd earned and what mattered most. The ability to protect Margaret without interference was already secured. One night, months after, I sat alone at my kitchen table in a small rental near the harbor, a place that smelled like salt and old wood, and the air coming through the cracked window was cold in that coastal way. Not freezing, just sharp enough to remind you you're alive. October had brought a thin fog that rolled in and erased the edges of the streetlights, and the world outside looked softened, forgiving. At 6:18 a.m., I poured coffee and watched my own hands, the veins, the weathering, the steadiness returning. I didn't feel like I'd won. I didn't feel like I'd punished Vanessa. What I felt was quieter than that. I felt relief. mixed with something like a sober confirmation, the kind of quiet triumph you don't brag about. Because it isn't about beating someone. It's about proving to yourself that your instincts weren't wrong, that the part of you that flinched at "figure it out yourself" was the part worth trusting. I called Mrs. Linton at 6:27 a.m. She answered on the second ring. "How's our girl Margaret?" she asked. Because that's what she called my mother now, like family is something you can choose into. "She's good," I said. "Daniel sent a picture yesterday. She was on the patio. She had that blanket she likes." Mrs. Linton hummed. "Good, she deserves peace." I stared at the steam rising from my mug and I said, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, though we both knew. "For saying yes," I said. "That morning." Her voice softened. "A decent person doesn't make you beg, Harold." We were quiet for 4 minutes and 40 seconds after that. Not awkward, just the kind of silence that finally has nothing left to defend. When I hung up, the fog outside thinned a little, and the light came in pale and steady, and I realized something simple, something that took me too long to learn. That loyalty isn't who shares your bed. It's who shows up when your hands are full and your heart is scared. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like release, like something that should have ended differently, from the very beginning. Loyalty is not a word. It's a practice. And love is not what people promise. It's what they protect. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. I will see you on the next one.